The sun rose over Sagebrush, New Mexico, like a confession. Its light spilling gold across a town baked hard by dust and secrets. In the quiet of a desert morning, the air carried the scent of sage and sorrow, heavy as a preacher's promise. Sagebrush was a place of cracked earth and stubborn hearts, where folks clung to their routines like lifelines, afraid to look too closely at what stirred in the shadows. At the edge of town, where the chapel's bell hung silent, Hannah Wells moved like a ghost through her chores, her small frame bent under the weight of a life that wasn't hers. She was 19, but her eyes hazel, deep as a dry well carried the weight of someone older, someone who'd learned to swallow pain whole. Hannah lived in the shadow of Reverend Elias Boone, a man whose voice could charm snakes from the sand. He'd taken her in after her parents perished in a flash flood 5 years back, calling it charity, but the town whispered of debts unpaid. She slept in a lean-to behind his adobe house, a cot with no blanket, her days filled with scrubbing floors and hauling water. The townsfolk saw her as the preacher's ward, quiet and obedient, but they never asked why her steps faltered or why her hands trembled when she knelt too long. Sagebrush was good at looking away. Inside the chapel kitchen, Hannah carried a stack of iron pots, her patched calico dress clinging to her frame, sweat beading on her brow despite the morning chill. The women preparing Sunday supper chattered, their voices sharp with gossip about a late cattle drive. Sister Ruth, a widow with a tongue like barbed wire, paused as Hannah set the pots down, wincing as she straightened. "What's wrong with you, girl?" Ruth asked, her eyes narrow. Hannah's voice was barely a whisper, dry as the desert air. "It hurts when I sit." The kitchen stilled, the words hanging like dust motes in sunlight. Ruth's lips pursed. "Mind your posture." "Then," she said, turning away. The others resumed their work, their silence louder than their words. Hannah slipped outside to the chapel steps, where she scrubbed with a rag and a bucket of lye water. Her wrists were red, her knuckles scraped raw, and when she eased onto the stone to rest, a sharp gasp escaped her lips. She bit it back, her hazel eyes scanning the empty street, fearing judgment. But someone was watching. Across the road, under the sagging awning of the livery, stood Amos, a blacksmith with hands scarred by fire and a heart scarred by loss. His beard was black streaked with gray, his dark brown eyes steady as stone. He'd buried his wife and son a decade ago, fever claiming them in a single winter. And since then, he'd spoken only when the forge demanded it. But Hannah's flinch stirred something in him, a memory of pain he couldn't save. That evening, during the chapel service, Hannah sat at the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap, where faint bruises marked her wrists like shadows of rope. The pews creaked under the weight of Sagebrush's faithful, their voices rising in a hymn that drowned the desert's quiet. Reverend Boone stood at the pulpit, his white shirt crisp, his gray eyes gleaming with a fire that felt more like control than grace. He preached of obedience, his hands gripping a worn Bible, never mentioning mercy. Hannah shifted, her breath catching as pain flared and a few heads turned. Boone's smile widened, his voice rising to cover her sound. But Amos, leaning against the chapel's outer wall, saw it all through the open door, his wide-brimmed hat low, his arms crossed. After the service, Hannah trudged back to Boone's house, her calico dress dust-stained, her steps slow. In the dim kitchen, Martha Boone, the Reverend's wife, sat polishing silver, her face sharp as a hawk's. "You're a disgrace." Gasping in church, she snapped, not looking up. "Pain's no excuse for weakness." Hannah said nothing, climbing the creaking stairs to her lean-to, where she curled on her cot, clutching a faded ribbon, her mother's last gift. Through a crack in the wall, a star flickered, and she whispered, "Someone see me," across town. Amos sat by his forge, the embers glowing red, his hands idle for the first time in years. He stared toward the chapel, Hannah's flinch replaying. In his mind, a spark he couldn't ignore. By morning, Sagebrush buzzed with whispers. Tom Haskell, the saloon keeper, had seen Amos lingering near the chapel, unusual for a man who avoided crowds. "He's stirring trouble," Tom muttered to the barber, who nodded. The talk reached Sheriff Jonah Tate, a lean man with a badge and a habit of looking the other way. He saddled his horse, his spurs glinting, and rode toward Amos's forge. "Folks say you're watching the preacher's girl," Tate said, his hazel eyes sharp. Amos met his gaze, his voice low and rough. "Someone's gotta." Tate's jaw tightened. "Mind your place, Creed. Boone's a man of God." Amos didn't blink. "God don't bruise wrists." Tate rode off, leaving dust in his wake. But the air felt heavier now, like a storm brewing over the mesa. Hannah, scrubbing the chapel steps again, felt eyes on her, not just Amos's, but someone else, hidden in the alley's shadows, watching with a purpose she couldn't name. Who was watching Hannah, and what danger did Amos's words awaken in Sagebrush? The desert sun climbed over Sagebrush, New Mexico, painting the dust and hues of fire and bone. The town stirred slow, its streets whispering secrets beneath the creak of wagon wheels and the clink of spurs. Hannah Wells knelt at the chapel steps, scrubbing with a rag so worn it barely held together, her patched calico dress soaked at the knees. Her hazel eyes, shadowed by exhaustion, darted toward the alley where she'd sensed eyes watching the day before. The air was thick with heat and unspoken truths, and Hannah's hands trembled, not from cold but from a pain that lived in her bones. She was 19, but each movement carried the weight of years under Reverend Elias Boone's roof, where mercy was a word preached but never shown. Inside the Boone household, Martha Boone ruled with a voice sharp as a switch. Her gray hair was pinned tight, her black dress starched, her eyes cold as the iron pots Hannah scrubbed. "You're too slow," Martha snapped, slamming a ladle on the table as Hannah hauled water from the pump. "The Lord don't favor the idle." Hannah said nothing, her wrists bruised under the sleeves, her body aching from nights on a bare cot. She worked in silence, her mother's faded ribbon tied at her waist, a tether to a life before Sagebrush claimed her. But the memory of Amos Creed's words to Sheriff Tate, "God don't bruise wrists," lingered like a spark in dry brush. Across town, Amos sat by his forge, the embers glowing like the grief he carried. His black beard, streaked with gray, caught the light as he hammered a horseshoe, the rhythm steady, but his mind elsewhere. 10 years had passed since fever took his wife, Sarah, and their son, Eli, leaving his cabin as empty as his voice. But Hannah's flinch in the chapel had stirred something, a memory of Sarah's quiet strength, of Ellie's small hand in his. He paused, his dark brown eyes fixed on the chapel's distant steeple, wondering who else had seen Hannah's pain and chosen to look away. The town buzzed with gossip by noon. Tom Haskell, the saloon keeper, leaned over his counter, muttering to the barber about Amos's visit to the sheriff. "Creed's stirring up trouble about that preacher's girl," he said, his voice low. "Ain't like him to care." The barber nodded, clipping scissors in the air. The whispers reached Sister Ruth at the mercantile, her lips pursing as she weighed flour. "Hannah's always been frail," she said, dismissing the talk, but the air felt heavier, like the desert holding its breath before a storm. Hannah, fetching eggs from the henhouse, felt the town's eyes on her. Her steps faltered as she passed the livery, where Amos stood, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the dust. He didn't speak, just watched, his dark brown eyes steady, not with pity, but with something fiercer recognition. "You don't have to hide it," he said, his voice rough from disuse, like gravel under boots. Hannah froze, her hazel eyes meeting his for a moment, wide with fear and something like hope. "They don't listen," she whispered, clutching the ribbon at her waist. "They never do." She turned away, her heart pounding, and hurried back to the chapel. That evening, Amos walked to the sheriff's office, his boots kicking up dust. Under a copper sky, Sheriff Jonah Tate sat outside, polishing his badge, his hazel eyes narrowing as Amos approached. "You're pushing hard, Creed," Tate said, his voice low. "Boone's a pillar here. You got no proof Hannah's hurt." Amos's jaw tightened, his hands scarred from the forge clenching. "Her wrists tell the truth," he said. "You seen Em." Tate shifted, uneasy, his toothpick snapping in his fingers. "You're a blacksmith, not a judge. Leave it be, or you'll turn this town against you." Amos didn't answer, just turned and walked away, his shadow long in the fading light. Back at the Boone house, Hannah knelt in the lean-to, her hands raw from scrubbing, her body aching from Martha's latest correction, a broom handle to her back for dropping a plate. She curled up, The ribbon pressed to her cheek and whispered to the starlet, "Crack in the wall, please don't stop seeing." The words felt like a prayer she didn't believe in anymore. Outside, a shadow moved in the alley, not Amos, but someone else. Their boots soft in the sand, a glint of steel catching the moonlight. As night fell, Amos sat on his porch, the forge's embers dying behind him. He held a small wooden horse, carved for Eli years ago, its edges worn smooth by time. Hannah's whisper echoed in his mind, and he knew the town's silence was a wall he'd have to break. But the shadow in the alley, watching Hannah's window, meant trouble was closer than he'd thought. Who was the shadow in the alley? And what danger was creeping toward Hannah's fragile hope? The desert stretched wide around Sagebrush, New Mexico, its sands glowing amber under a sun that burned without mercy. The town hummed with the rhythm of daily life, wagons rattling, voices bartering, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer butt. Beneath it all lay a silence that swallowed truth's whole. Hannah Wells knelt by the chapel well, hauling water with hands raw from lie, her patched calico dress clinging to her frame. Her hazel eyes, shadowed by pain, flickered toward the alley where a stranger's shadow had lingered the night before. At 19, she moved like someone carrying a weight no one else could see. Her body bruised from Reverend Elias Boone's charity and his wife Martha's sharp corrections. Inside the Boone household, Martha's voice cut through the morning. Stillness, sharp as a blade. "You're dawdlin' again, girl," she snapped, her black dress rustling as she swept through the kitchen, a wooden spoon in hand. Hannah, scrubbing a pot, flinched as Martha's shadow loomed, her wrists marked with faint bruises under her sleeves. "The Lord tests the lazy," Martha said, raising the spoon but pausing as Hannah met her gaze, hazel eyes steady for the first time. "I'm workin'," Hannah whispered, her voice dry but firm. Martha's lips tightened, and she turned away, but the air crackled with something new, defiance, small but growing. Across town, Amos Creed worked his forge, the fire's glow, painting his scarred hands and gray-streaked beard in shades of red. His dark brown eyes, usually fixed on iron, drifted to the chapel's steeple, where Hannah's flinch replayed in his mind. The memory of his wife, Sarah, and son, Eli, lost to fever, weighed heavy. But Hannah's whispered words, "They don't listen," had stirred a rusted instinct to protect. He set down his hammer, the wooden horse he'd carved for Eli tucked in his pocket, and walked toward the chapel, his boots kicking up dust under a sky bruised with heat. Sagebrush buzzed with whispers by midday. Tom Haskell, the saloon keeper, leaned over his bar, muttering to Sister Ruth about Amos's talk with Sheriff Tate. "Creed's got no business poking at the preacher's affairs," Tom said. Wiping a glass, Ruth nodded, her widow's bonnet bobbing. "Hannah's frail, always has been, ain't no story there." But the gossip spread, reaching the mercantile, where Clara Dunn, a young seamstress, paused her stitching, her brown eyes thoughtful. "She don't look frail to me," Clara said softly, but no one replied. The town's silence was a wall, and Hannah stood alone behind it. Hannah, fetching wood from the chapel shed, felt Amos's gaze before she saw him. He stood across the street, his wide-brimmed hat low, his broad shoulders casting a shadow like a shield. "You don't have to stay quiet," he said, his voice rough but steady, like a fire banked low. Hannah's hands tightened on the wood, her ribbons swaying at her waist. "Last one who spoke up disappeared," she said, her hazel eyes flickering with fear and hope. "They said she ran off, but I know better." Amos stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "You ain't her," he said, "and I ain't them." Hannah's breath caught, and she turned away, but his words lingered like a spark in her heart. That evening, Amos strode to the chapel, his boots heavy on the dusty steps. Reverend Boone stood inside, adjusting hymnals, his gray eyes narrowing. As Amos entered, "Brother Creed," Boone said, his smile sharp as a knife. "Come to pray?" Amos's jaw clenched, his hand brushing the wooden horse in his pocket. "Hannah shouldn't be under your roof," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "She flinches like a dog that's been hit too many times." Boone's smile faltered, his hands tightening on the Bible. "You're treading on sacred ground, blacksmith. Mind your words." Amos didn't blink. "I see what you hide," he said, turning to leave, his shadow long in the candlelight. Outside, Hannah overheard from the vestibule. Her heart pounding, Amos's words were a crack. In the wall of silence she'd lived behind, a flicker of hope she hadn't dared to feel. But as she slipped back to the Boone house, Martha waited in the kitchen, her spoon raised like a gavel. "You've been talkin'," she hissed, striking Hannah's shoulder, the pain sharp and familiar. Hannah didn't cry out, her hazel eyes burning. "I didn't say nothin'," she said, her voice stronger now. Martha's face twisted, and she shoved Hannah toward the lean-to. "You'll learn to hold your tongue," she said, locking the door. In her tiny room, Hannah curled on the cot, clutching her mother's ribbon. The starlight through the walls cracked her only comfort. She whispered, "Keep seeing me," her voice a prayer to Amos, to anyone who'd listen. Outside, the shadow in the alley moved again. Closer now, a glint of steel in their hand, their boots silent in the sand. Across town, Amos sat by his forge, the wooden horse in his palm, his dark brown eyes fixed on the chapel. He knew his words had stirred a hornet's nest, and the shadow watching Hannah meant trouble was no longer a whisper. The desert night draped Sagebrush, New Mexico, in a shroud of stars, their light sharp as truths too long buried. The town slept uneasily, its silence broken only by the faint howl of wind. Across the mesa, carrying whispers of secrets no one dared to speak, Hannah Wells lay curled in her lean-to behind Reverend Elias Boone's adobe house, her patched calico dress folded beside her, her mother's faded ribbon clutched in her hand. Her hazel eyes, weary but fierce, stared through the crack in the wall where a single star burned, a beacon in her darkness. The bruises on her wrists and shoulders ached, Martha Boone's latest correction still stinging. But Amos Creed's words, "I see what you hide," had kindled a spark she couldn't extinguish. Hannah rose, her movements slow but deliberate, each step a rebellion against the pain that tethered her to this place. In the dim light, she gathered her meager belongings, the ribbon, a small tin of salve for her bruises, a worn prayer book with her mother's handwriting in the margins, and a single copper coin, all she had left of a life before Boone's charity. She tied them in a scrap of cloth, her hands trembling not with fear but with purpose. The lean-to's door creaked as she slipped into the night, the desert air cold against her skin. She paused at the edge of the Boone house, glancing back at the dark windows, and left a folded note tucked under a stone. "If I don't make it, give this to the man who saw me." Amos Creed sat by his forge, the embers casting a faint glow across his scarred hands and gray-streaked beard. The wooden horse he'd carved for his son, Eli, rested on the table, its edges worn by years of grief. His dark brown eyes, usually fixed on iron, stared toward the chapel. Hannah's whispered warning, the last one, disappeared, echoing. In his mind, he'd stirred trouble confronting Boone, and the shadow in the alley meant Sagebrush's silence was turning dangerous. A soft knock broke his thoughts, hesitant but urgent. He opened the door to find Hannah, her calico dress torn at the hem, her hazel eyes wide with resolve and fear, dust clinging to her face like a second skin. "Come in," Amos said, his voice rough but warm, stepping aside. Hannah hesitated, then crossed the threshold, clutching her bundle. "I can't stay there," she whispered, her breath unsteady. "Not another night," Amos nodded, offering a blanket and a tin cup of coffee, its steam curling in the cool air. "You're safe here," he said, his eyes steady, a promise carved in stone. Hannah sat by the fire, her shoulders easing for the first time in years, the ribbon at her waist catching the firelight. Their silence wasn't empty, it was a bridge, built from shared defiance. Against a town that looked away. By dawn, Sagebrush woke to whispers of Hannah's absence. Tom Haskell, the saloon keeper, leaned over his bar, muttering to Clara Dunn, the seamstress, about the preacher's empty lean-to. "Girls run off," he said, shaking his head. Clara's brown eyes flickered, her needle pausing. "Or she's finally free," she said softly, but Tom turned away. The talk reached Sheriff Jonah Tate, who stood outside the Boone house, his hazel eyes scanning the note Hannah left. Reverend Boone emerged, his gray eyes cold, his white shirt crisp despite the hour. "She's a troubled soul," Boone said, his voice smooth as venom. "We must bring her back for her own good." Tate's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His spurs glinting as he mounted his horse. At Amos's cabin, Hannah helped stack firewood. Her movements slow but determined, her hazel eyes brighter. In the morning light, Amos watched, his hands idle. The wooden horse in his pocket a reminder of what he'd lost and what he wouldn't let happen again. "They'll come for you," he said, his voice low, like the wind before a storm. Hannah nodded, her ribbons swaying. "Let 'em," she said, her voice stronger now. "I ain't going back." Amos handed her a small knife, its handle worn but steady. "For protection," he said, their fingers brushing, a fleeting warmth in the desert chill. As dusk fell, the town's whispers grew sharper. Sister Ruth, at the mercantile, spoke of Boone's plan to save Hannah, her bonnet bobbing with righteous zeal. But Clara Dunn lingered, her hands still, her mind turning over Hannah's bruises. Outside Amos's cabin, a shadow moved in. The sagebrush, not the same as before, but familiar, a figure with a glint of steel. Their boots silent in the sand. Hannah froze, her hand on the knife, as Amos stepped to the door, his dark brown eyes scanning the darkness. The air was thick with danger, and the shadow's presence meant Boone's reach was longer than they'd feared. Who was the shadow in the sagebrush, and what did Boone want with Hannah's newfound freedom? The desert dawn broke over Sagebrush, New Mexico, painting the sands in hues of blood and gold. As if the land itself sensed the storm brewing in its heart, the town stirred, its streets heavy with whispers and dust, the chapel's bell silent. But looming like a judge, Hannah Wells stood outside Amos Creed's cabin, her patched calico dress dusted with sand, her hazel eyes fierce despite the bruise marking her wrists. The small knife Amos had given her hung at her waist, a weight that felt more like freedom than fear. Inside, Amos stoked the forge, his gray-streaked beard catching the fire's glow, his dark brown eyes steady as he polished the wooden horse carved for his lost son, Eli. The shadow in the sagebrush from the night before lingered in their minds, a warning that Reverend Elias Boone's reach was closing in. Sagebrush buzzed with tension by mid-morning. Tom Haskell, the saloon keeper, muttered to Sister Ruth at the mercantile about Hannah's escape. "She's with that blacksmith," he said, his voice low. "Boone ain't happy." Ruth's bonnet bobbed, her lips tight. "She's bringing shame on the preacher," she replied. But Clara Dunn, the seamstress, paused her stitching nearby, her brown eyes narrowing. "Maybe the shame's not hers," she said softly, her words a spark in the dry air. The gossip reached Sheriff Jonah Tate, who stood by the chapel, his hazel eyes scanning the horizon, his badge glinting as he wrestled with Amos's words. About Hannah's bruises. At the cabin, Hannah hauled water from a nearby well, her movements slow but deliberate, the ribbon at her waist swaying like a promise. Amos watched from the porch, his broad shoulders taut, the wooden horse in his pocket, a reminder of what he'd lost and what he'd fight to save. "They'll come," he said, his voice rough but warm, like a fire banked low. Hannah nodded, her hand brushing the knife. "I ain't runnin'," she said, her hazel eyes blazing with a courage she hadn't known she had. Their gazes met, a silent vow forged in the desert heat, their bond a bridge over years of pain. The hoof beats came at noon, heavy and purposeful, kicking up dust like a warning. Sheriff Tate rode up, his spurs glinting, flanked by two of Boone's loyal deacons, Ezra Holt, a weary farmer with cold gray eyes, and Samuel Pike, a burly rancher with a shotgun. "Hannah," Tate called, dismounting, his voice firm but uneasy. "Boone wants you back, says you're his ward, under church care." Hannah stepped onto the porch, her calico dress catching the wind, her knife gleaming. "I ain't his," she said, her voice steady. Amos joined her, his dark brown eyes hard, a hammer in his hand. "She stays," he said, his tone a challenge. "Carved in stone." Ezra Holt spat into the dust, his gray eyes narrowing. "You're defying a man of God, Creed. This town won't stand for it." Samuel raised his shotgun, but Tate raised a hand, his hazel eyes flickering with doubt. "No need for that," he said, stepping closer. "Hannah, you got proof. Boone's hurting you." Hannah's hand tightened on the knife, her wrists visible, the bruises dark against her skin. "Look at me," she said, her voice low but fierce. "Ain't that enough?" Tate's jaw clenched, his gaze lingering on her scars, but before he could speak, A new figure emerged from the sagebrush. Clara Dunn, her brown eyes fierce, a pitchfork in her hands. "Leave her be," Clara called, her voice cutting through the tension. Behind her, a few townsfolk, Leela Gray, a baker, and young Ben Tate. The sheriff's nephew stepped forward, their faces uneasy but resolute. "We seen her Bruises," Leela said, her apron dusted with flour. "Boone ain't what he seems." The deacons hesitated, their weapons lowering, but Ezra's eyes burned. "You'll answer for this," he growled, mounting his horse. Tate lingered, his toothpick snapping, then rode off with the deacons. The dust settling like a held breath. Inside the cabin, Hannah and Amos sat by the fire, the wooden horse on the table between them. "You didn't have to stand with me," Hannah said, her hazel eyes soft, the ribbon catching the firelight. Amos's gaze met hers, warm and unyielding. "You stood first," he said, his scarred hand brushing hers, a fleeting warmth that felt like home. But outside, the shadow in the sagebrush moved again, closer now. A glint of steel and a whispered voice calling Boone's name. Who was the shadow allied with Boone? And what secret were they guarding in Sagebrush's dust? The desert sky over Sagebrush, New Mexico, burned copper at dusk. As if the heavens were holding their breath for a reckoning, the town lay quiet, its dusty streets haunted by whispers that grew sharper with each passing hour. Hannah Wells stood inside Amos Creed's cabin, her patched calico dress dusted with sand, her hazel eyes fierce as she gripped the small knife at her waist, the ribbon tied there. Her mother's last gift, swayed like a promise she'd fight to keep. Amos stood by the window, his gray-streaked beard catching the fire's glow, his dark brown eyes scanning the sagebrush where a shadow had moved the night before. The wooden horse in his pocket, carved for his lost son, Eli, felt heavier now, a reminder of what he'd protect at any cost. The standoff with Sheriff Tate and Boone's deacons had shaken Sagebrush, but the town's silence held firm, a wall, built of fear and habit. Clara Dunn, the seamstress, had spread word of Hannah's bruises, her brown eyes fierce as she spoke to Leela Gray at the Mercantile. "She ain't frail," Clara said, her needle still. "Boone's hidin' something." Leela nodded, her baker's hands dusted with flour, but Tom Haskell, the saloon keeper, scoffed nearby. "Creed's stirrin' trouble for nothin'," he muttered. The whispers reached Reverend Elias Boone, who stood in the chapel, his gray eyes cold as he polished the pulpit, his white shirt crisp despite the heat. "Hannah's lost her way," he told Sister Ruth, his voice smooth as venom. "We'll bring her home." At the cabin, Hannah sat by the fire, her hands steady as she sharpened the knife Amos had given her. "They won't stop," she said, her voice low but strong, like a river carving stone. Amos nodded, his scarred hands stoking the forge's embers. "They'll try to break you," he said, his dark brown eyes meeting hers, warm with a promise, unspoken. "But you ain't alone no more." Their silence was a bond, woven from shared defiance. And when their hands brushed, the touch lingered, a spark of hope in the desert's chill. A knock came, sharp and urgent, breaking the quiet. Amos opened the door to find Clara Dunn, her brown eyes wide, a folded letter in her trembling hands. "Found this in my shop," she said, her voice low. "It's from a girl who lived with Boone before you, Hannah. She left it years ago." Hid in a seam, Hannah took the letter, her heart pounding, and read aloud, "If you find this, I wasn't the first. Boone's prayers are lies. He hurts us in the dark. Tell someone who'll believe." The words hit like a thunderclap, and Hannah's hazel eyes burned with a truth she'd always known but never named. The plot twist landed hard. Boone wasn't just a harsh master, he was a predator, his crimes hidden by Sagebrush's silence. "Her name was Leela," Clara said, her voice shaking. "She disappeared, same as you said." Hannah's hand tightened on the ribbon, her voice steady. "I'm going back," she said. "They need to hear this." Amos's jaw clenched, his hand brushing the wooden horse. "It's dangerous," he said, but his eyes said he'd follow her anywhere. Clara nodded, her pitchfork leaning against the wall. "I'm with you," she said, her brown eyes fierce. They planned to confront Boone at the chapel, where the town gathered for evening prayer. The letter their weapon against his lies. As night fell, the chapel glowed with lantern light, its bell tolling like a call to judgment. Hannah walked through, Sagebrush's streets, the letter in her hand, Amos at her side, his hammer tucked in his belt, Clara close behind. The townsfolk stared. Leela Gray, Ben Tate, even Tom Haskell, but none spoke, their eyes uneasy. Inside, Boone stood at the pulpit, his gray eyes gleaming, his Bible open to a verse on obedience. Hannah stepped forward, her calico dress catching the light, and raised the letter. "This is from Leela," she said, her voice clear, cutting through the hymns. "She lived in your house, Boone. She suffered, like me. You ain't a man of God." The chapel stilled, gasps rippling through the pews. Boone's smile faltered, his hands gripping the pulpit. "Lies from a troubled girl," he said, but his voice wavered. Clara stepped up, her brown eyes blazing. "We found her letter. You can't hide no more." The crowd murmured, doubt cracking their silence. Amos stood by Hannah, his presence a shield, his dark brown eyes daring Boone to move. But outside, a shadow lingered in the alley, a glint of steel in their hand, their whispered voice calling Boone's name, a secret ally ready to strike. Who was Boone's ally in the shadows? And would Hannah's truth break Sagebrush's silence or ignite its wrath? The desert dawn broke over Sagebrush, New Mexico, like a hymn, its golden light spilling across the sands in waves of fire and hope, as if the land itself rose to bear witness to a long-buried truth. The chapel's bell tolled low and heavy, not for prayer but for judgment, its echo slicing through the dust like a blade through silence. Hannah Wells stood on the chapel steps, her patched calico dress catching the morning breeze, her hazel eyes blazing with a courage forged in years of pain. The letter from Leela, the girl who'd suffered before her under Reverend Elias Boone's roof, was clutched in her hand, its words a torch against his lies. Amos Creed stood beside her, his gray-streaked beard dusted with sand, his dark brown eyes steady as he gripped the hammer at his belt, the wooden horse in his pocket a relic of his lost son, Eli a vow to protect what he'd found. The shadow in the alley, Boone's secret ally, loomed closer, a glint of steel in the half-light, threatening to snuff out Hannah's spark dot inside the chapel. The pews groaned under the weight of Sagebrush's townsfolk, their faces a tapestry of doubt, fear, and dawning shame. Clara Dunn, the seamstress, stood near the front, her brown eyes fierce, her pitchfork propped against a pew like a banner of defiance. Leela Gray, the baker, and Ben Tate, the sheriff's young nephew, flanked her, their resolve a crack in the town's wall of silence. Reverend Boone stood at the pulpit, his gray eyes cold as slate, his white shirt crisp despite the heat, his Bible open but untouched, a prop for his faltering mask. "Hannah speaks lies," he declared, his voice smooth, but fraying, tempted by a blacksmith's reckless heart. Hannah stepped forward, her ribbons swaying at her waist, and raised the letter, her voice clear as a desert spring. "Leela wrote this," she said, reading aloud. "If you find this, I wasn't the first. Boone's prayers are lies. He hurts. U.S. in the dark." The chapel stilled, gasps rippling through the air like stones in a pond. Boone's smile cracked, his hands gripping the pulpit until his knuckles whitened. "Blasphemy from a troubled soul," he shouted, but a figure stepped from the shadowed vestibule. Ezra Holt, his loyal deacon, his gray eyes heavy with guilt, a leather pouch trembling in his hand. "It's true," Ezra said, his voice breaking like dry wood. "I helped Boone hide Lila's disappearance. He paid me to burn her things, to say she ran off." The plot twist struck like lightning. Ezra, the shadow in the alley, had been Boone's enforcer. Bound by coin and fear, now crumbling under the weight of truth, the pouch fell open, revealing Lila's locket, its silver etched with her initials, proof of Boone's crimes glinting in the lantern light. Clara surged forward, her pitchfork raised, her brown eyes blazing like embers. "You let her suffer," she cried, her voice a spark in the dry air. Leela Gray stood, her baker's hands clenched, tears streaking her flour-dusted face. "We looked away," she said, her voice soft but searing. Ben Tate, barely 16, gripped his hat, his hazel eyes wide but resolute. The crowd stirred, women rising. Sister Ruth, her bonnet askew, her lips trembling. Even Martha Boone, her face pale as ash, her black dress sagging with shame. Sheriff Jonah Tate pushed through the pews, his badge glinting, his hazel eyes hard. with a truth he could no longer dodge. "Enough, Elias," he said, his voice low as thunder. "You're done." Boone lunged for the door, his Bible falling to the floor, but Amos moved like a storm, his hammer pinning Boone's sleeve to the chapel wall with a thud that echoed like justice. "You don't run," Amos growled, his dark brown eyes fierce. A fire rekindled after years of grief. Hannah stepped beside him, her hazel eyes wet but unyielding, the letter steady in her hand. "You answer for Leela," she said, "and for me." The crowd roared, their silence shattered, as Tate bound Boone's wrists with rope, his spurs clinking as he led him out. Martha fled, her black dress trailing dust, her head bowed as the town turned away. Her reign of cruelty ended in a single morning. Outside, Clara rang the chapel bell. Its toll a song of truth, not Boone's hollow sermons. Hannah and Amos walked to the edge of town, where a lone cottonwood marked Tully's grave, its branches whispering in the breeze. Hannah knelt, placing her mother's ribbon beside the stone. Its faded blue a quiet offering. "They're free now," she said, her voice soft as dawn. Amos's scarred hand found hers, warm and steady, his eyes soft with a hope he'd thought buried with his son. "So are we," he whispered, the wooden horse now a bridge to a future they'd build. Together. Beyond Sagebrush, they rebuilt a homestead near a dry creek, an adobe with sagebrush blooming like defiance. Hannah planted herbs, her hands no longer raw, her hazel eyes bright with purpose. Amos hammered beams, the wooden horse now on a shelf, a symbol of healing. At the summer fair, Hannah stood at a stall, her calico dress clean, selling scarves, woven with care, her smile a beacon to a town changed by her courage. Sagebrush learned that justice rises when silence falls, a truth carved in the Old West's heart. One voice, brave enough to speak, can break a town's chains. If Hannah's stand stirs your soul, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of courage and hope. Share your thoughts below. Did her truth move you? But as they left Sagebrush, Lila's locket, tucked in Hannah's pocket, bore an engraving. They hadn't read what final secret whispered of a past yet to be faced.